Welcome to the Hardwood Hustle, powered by PGC Basketball. We believe in the value of a coach. We're here to educate, empower, and encourage you to lead like never before. This week, we're excited to have JP Nerbun return to the Hardwood Hustle. He's the founder and president of Thrive on Challenge, author of Calling Up, and host of the Coaching Culture podcast. Today, we talk about his latest book, The Culture System, and discuss how coaches can build a thriving culture on their teams. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Hardwood Hustle. We got a special guest today. This is a longtime friend of us and the Hardwood Hustle and PGC, and just completed a new book that we're going to talk about, a book that I think can really help you and help your team build a better culture. So JP Nerbun, thank you so much for coming on, and we're excited to talk about the book and really just in general talk about culture and just how coaches can make a better culture. And I know it's a buzzword, but not many people invest a bunch of their life into this, and you are investing your life into this. How can you create better cultures? And so, first of all, just welcome. Glad to have you.
Yeah, it's good to be on here. You as Sam and Mono have made a huge impact in my journey as a coach, and I got to give you guys a lot of credit for helping me start to get a bit of a head start on the idea of culture and how to build it.
Yeah, well, the culture system, a proven process for creating an extraordinary team culture. Let's just talk about where it started. Like, what made you think I need to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, it came really in the process of writing my first book, Calling Up, which I believe I was in the podcast maybe 3 years ago with Adam, talking a little bit about. But you got to come back to my roots and my journey as a coach. And I was in high school coaching, and it's over maybe about 10 years in the business of coaching, and coached internationally, professionally. And if I look back at all my teams, you know, some years I had great cultures, some years I had average cultures, but I kind of went through a string of, you know, a few bad years. And it was painful. It was painful, obviously, because you're not getting the results that you think you can get when you got a poor culture. And it's painful because your experience as a coach and that of the players isn't what you want, and you're not having the impact that you want to have as a coach on their lives. And so that kind of set me out on this journey to like really figure this out. And, you know, I invested in a mentor. I started really, when I would go to a PGC Glacier clinic, I would just attend the culture aspects of the workshops. I really, really withdrew from the tactical X's and O's of it. And anyways, I just jumped in on this and started studying culture nonstop. And that involved a lot of reading books as well of exceptional leaders, exceptional coaches, behavioral science, therapy, neuroscience. I wanted to learn everything about, culture, human behavior, how to drive that change. And also started a podcast, Coaching Culture podcast. So I started to get to interview all these amazing people, and started to share those obviously on the podcast and through my writing. And that led to me working with a lot of coaches. And as I was working with these coaches and we were testing out different strategies and tools, we started to land on some solid things that were working across the board, that would work across the board for all the coaches, regardless of the level they were coaching at, high school, collegiate, professional, or regardless of the sport. But also they worked in other environments, business, the medical field, schools. It's just culture is built upon many similar tools. And so as we started to build a process or a system for being able to implement these strategies consistently over time, that's where we kind of landed on the culture system about 5 years ago. And we've been running with it since.
Yeah. So, you just got done running an ultra marathon?
Yeah, just last Friday.
Yeah, I imagine, are you thinking about writing during that time? I can't even imagine what's going through your mind in an ultra marathon there. Are you thinking about culture topics when you're running or just surviving?
It's funny because the whole week was building up to the run. I was also crazy because I was launching the book. And so every night I'm not sleeping as much as I should have, building up to an ultra marathon where I'm running 82 miles. And you go to bed and TJ and Sam, when you're like really big into a project, like you go to bed thinking about it, you dream about it, and you wake up from it. So like I hadn't gotten the book off my mind the entire week. I got out there and was embracing the elements. I was running through the mountains of Ireland, and then for the first 10 hours. The next 10 hours was just pain. So I didn't really think about the book a whole lot during that time.
Well, congrats on that. That's a pretty big week where you get an ultra marathon and release a book in the same week. That's a pretty big week. So congrats on that. Well, let's dive in a little bit into some of the content, like just kind of give us some teasers here. And as you were going through and you were researching, how did you decide where to start with this book?
It's funny because I've been playing with the outline for this book for about 5 years, and it wasn't until about a year and a half ago that I really got in the nitty gritty of writing it. If you look at, when it comes to building exceptional cultures, you study the exceptional ones in sports or in business, you recognize, if you really, in my book, there's 20 chapters, but you really start to recognize similar tools across all these different fields, and so I've kind of maybe made a list of maybe 22 tools or methods or strategies and that can be implemented. Now, not every team, not every coach, not every leader has all 22. In fact, none of them do. But if you look at the whole, you see there's always some common ones. And it's so cool. So when I break these tools down, I really kind of break them into how we establish culture, which is the relationships and standards, is how I define culture, is the strength of your relationships and how high your standards are. What standards are the behaviors, not what you say are the behaviors, the desired behaviors, the actual behaviors. So when you establish culture, some of those tools can be broken into that category. The other one is how you support culture. How do you support those behaviors? How do you support those relationships? And lastly, the last big piece of that process is how you enforce it. It's the accountability piece. So how are you enforcing those standards? And you're doing all those things in a way that aligns with your philosophy as a coach. And so it's merging our philosophy as a coach, which is our vision, our values, what we desire for as our impact and the type of culture we're trying to create. But it's merging that with a systematic approach, which is making sure that you're establishing, you're supporting, and enforcing, and you're using some of those tools and methods in there. And I'll take a break here in a second, but I'm just going to share this. It's so cool to see things like, for instance, when it comes to establishing standards, you've got your non-negotiables. John Wooden had non-negotiables. Pete Carroll has non-negotiables. Captain Mike Abershoff, who I've interviewed on my podcast, he took the USS Benfold, a Navy ship, the worst ship in the entire U.S. Navy back in 2001, and he turned it into the best U.S. ship in the Navy in 2002. In 1 year, he had that turnaround. He had non-negotiables, right? They all have non-negotiables. And so I had written the book, or at least the first draft of the book, and I'm sitting there at the Phoenix Suns facility, watching practice, and I was talking with actually Monty after their practice back in October. And I look up, in their office, and it's their office spaces overlooking the practice facility floor. And right above his desk, what is there? It's his non-negotiables. So, you see all these coaches have these tools, and they also have the tools to be able to support and enforce those non-negotiables. So that's just one example of, one of the many tools that I kind of lay out in my book, or I work with the coaches on to really determine their non-negotiables and then to actually implement them within the culture.
Yeah, JP, and there's so much we can talk about here. I'm excited just hearing you speak on some of this stuff. When you think about non-negotiable, this just came in my mind on the cuff here, but it's like there is non-negotiables. So I have a two-part question. How many non-negotiables should a coach have? Because some coaches might have 17 pillars, and if your kids don't know 3 of them, then, less is more, right? So I'd be curious to know what's that magic number if there's non-negotiables. And 2, are there negotiables in your culture, or isn't everything non-negotiable? Speak to that a little bit too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I'll answer the second part of that question first. The non-negotiables are the coach standards, and everything after that is kind of negotiable. It's up for discussion if you want your players to take ownership of those standards. And so we've built out what's called now the team manifesto, which is where you sit down and you actually, you've already communicated your non-negotiables. You've already kind of maybe set the vision or values of the program, but you allow your players to maybe interpret what that vision and values are and what they look like for them, and to kind of help you to craft those standards maybe for that year or to revise them year to year. And I have to give years and years ago the credit. The very first version of me doing that, I learned from Mano. Right, I had a PGC Glacier clinic, right? And he laid it out on how you do it at a pizza party for your team. And, that's just evolved for us over the years. So when it comes to the magic number seems to be, if there was a magic number, it seems to be 3. But it could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 1, right? At the end of the day, how many should you have? Well, every one you add is now one more thing that you can't negotiate over. And it's one more thing that you have to hold them accountable to every single day, right? If you say be on time, there has to be some sort of consequence. There has to be follow through every single time. Now, it may look different to follow through depending on the circumstances, but bottom line is you don't let that slip. If you say listening is a non-negotiable, or competing, or no complaining, or no blaming, complaining, or all those things, like all of a sudden now you have to enforce that at all times as a coach. The best way to come up with a non-negotiables from my perspective, if I'm trying to come up, if I encourage coaches to come up with them, is what are the most biggest pain points for you as a coach? What things destroy your environment? So for me, if people are late, it really throws me off. It really throws the practice off. If kids aren't listening, I can't coach. I can't teach them an environment where they're not listening. And if people are complaining, it's negative energy just saps everything. I used to have competing, but competing is kind of vague. It's a little bit more general. It's not as observable. So it's a little bit harder to enforce. But complaining, we know what it is, right? And we can call it right out, and we can address it right in that situation. And we can, support the standard as well there too. But those are 3 things that just absolutely just tear apart the environment and make it almost impossible for me to do my job. After that, I'll work with you on everything else. But I'm always going to fight for those 3 things.
And that's really good. So I'm repeating it for the listener here. You said, listen, don't be late, and don't complain. Those are the 3, right?
You listen, be on time, and no complaining would be my 3. Those would be my 3.
Yeah, and I've used 3. The 3 I've used in the last 5-6 years with teams I've coached is, just number 1, give your best effort. And you said competing. I would agree. Like if we leveled up, it would be competing. Give your best effort, be a great teammate. And then number 3 is be coachable. Now you have to define that and get really specific and give players examples. I think a lot of coaches make mistakes. They put it on the wall or they type it up, but there's no specificity to it and there's not high clarity. And, JP, so on that, we had like in our PGC coaching, just to give you some context, our 5 kind of components under culture are vision and values, environment, standards, accountability, and then the last one's conflict and adversity. And so TJ, he's got a phenomenal program and culture at Emmanuel with his college team. And I agree with what he says. A statement he said a few years ago at one of our clinics is a good culture is like a well-functioning family. You're going to have a lot of fun together. You're going to, enjoy each other, but you're also going to have some conflict and adversity. You're going to cry. You're going to get upset with each other. So when the culture is not, when the standard drops or it's not met, what's your action plan to help make sure the standards reset?
Great question. And it comes back to the established phase first is the first step. So have you established relationships with the players where it's not just based on, them as the athlete, but them as a person. So there's that mutual respect and relationship. And you do that through some initial, even just the way you approach them from your initial conversations. And, back to Abershoff, captain of the Benfold there, he does something that we find so many other great coaches doing too, which is on his first month on that ship, he sat down with every single one of them and had one-on-one conversations, asking them 3 questions. What do you enjoy about this ship? What don't you enjoy? If you could change one thing, what would you change? Right? All these other great coaches that we've studied and I've worked with, these are the 3 magical questions to initially kind of get things going. But it's also about sharing about yourself. It's building that relationship. You can't enforce a standard without a relationship. Okay. That's so important. But before you enforce the standard, right, there's a level of support. The reality is we have to drop this expectation that just because we set a standard in our team, that means our players are going to fall through it. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all fall short. And so that's why we talk about support before accountability. The support becomes before the enforce piece. So sometimes in support, and I share a lot of tools and methods around how to support it. A lot of times we talk about using questions just to bring awareness to the behavior, using questions to help them to identify, okay, you were late. Why are you struggling to be on time? and helping them to identify their obstacles. If they're not competing or not giving their best effort, Sam, in that situation, you might be like, hey, there seems to be something off today for this player because this is totally abnormal from him, or her. So, hey, what's going on there? Or if it's something that's consistent, you might be, hey, we've talked about this in the last few weeks, right? So you might have a trigger word that brings them back to this idea of like, hey, we've talked about this. We need you to work on your effort. You agreed to work on this. So you might even have a code word, that you might use to help kind of call them up in that moment to remind them of the standard that they've agreed to. And that's why we try to say we want to move a lot of the standards away from the coach and onto the team, because once we've sat down with them and we said, hey, guys, what are the standards here? What do we need to do to be successful? What do we need to do to achieve the things that we want to achieve? What do we need to do to have the experience that we want to have? And they've all agreed to that. Then you just, when you're holding them to that standard or you're supporting them, you're just reminding them of the standard. And sometimes that's just enough to bring them back and help them to adjust, to self-correct their effort or their attitude or whatever it is.
JP, got a couple quick ones here for you. Where do you find it breaks down the most? Is it established, support, or enforced? Like, where do you think most cultures hit a roadblock or stumble?
I would say two things. One is it breaks down within the coach themselves. And I know this from personal experience. What I mean by breaks down the coach themselves is when there is conflict, we either withdraw as a coach, we become permissive, and we make excuses for our players. That wasn't my problem. My problem was I went like the rage monster came out of me, and I would lose my temper, and all of a sudden now I've lost any ability to help that individual to make an adjustment. If they make an adjustment, it's only out of fear and not from a place that aligns with my value, which is I want them, to operate from a place where they want to work hard because that's who they want to be, because they know that's what they need to do to achieve it. I want them to become intrinsically motivated. But if I'm using fear to motivate them, now I've lost the ground. So the first place you see it breaks down is us, the coach, either running from the situation or charging too hard into it. The second area that it breaks down is that we lack the alternative tools to enforce the standard in a way that's both kind and firm. So I knew that yelling was not the way that I wanted to hold my players accountable for years. I knew that. But I didn't know any other way, TJ. Like, it was either like yell at them, make them run, or you just ignore it. Or you just keep peppering, like words of encouragement. Come on, guys, I know you can turn it around, and that doesn't work after a while. So you have to find alternative ways to enforce a standard in a way that, they've agreed to those consequences, and that reinforces this idea that they should want to be out here working hard. They should want to be listening because that's going to lead to their success. And so if you can enforce the standard in a way that reinforces your values and what you're trying to teach them, then you're going to be more successful.
Yeah, I often say demanding without being demeaning, and I think that's such a fine line. And it's an interesting thing because be curious as to your thoughts on this with coaches. I think the best coaches I've ever been around at handling culture are really good in the messy middle. They know how to have hard conversations. They know how to challenge. They know how to pull back, and they know how to, just change what might be going on in the environment. Do you think a lot of coaches, and what can coaches, and I'm sure your book has a lot of tools in here to be able to help coaches, but how do you become better at managing that? I mean, there are some people, like you said, that just run right into the fire. There's people that run away from it, but that there's a lot that's got to happen in the middle to make a culture go well. What do you do to gain the skills if you don't necessarily have those skills?
Well, one thing is by agreeing to coming up with some consequences that will be shared consequences across the team, you're kind of pre-planning the intervention. And everyone's kind of agreed, all right? So we know the plan of action when we fail to show up on time. We know the plan of action as much as we can when we're not competing. And that's a key first step, right? It's so oftentimes these coaches that are really demanding and assertive in the moments, but they're not demeaning. It's because of these conversations they've had, these relationships they've built before that moment. And I call it the conversation before the conversation. So we got to be good at building those relationships, but also establishing like what those consequences look like so that when a player gets those consequences, we can, as a coach, can reinforce their choice. So you're choosing to not work hard. So thus the standard is, or the consequence is you're not going to get to participate in the rest of this drill. You have to step out off the drill. Okay. So we're enforcing there what I like to call progressive or consequences, which are a type of what we call logical consequence, in the sense that if you don't work hard, right, why would I make you run? Right? Running is supposed to be something that's good for you. Basketball is a privilege. Showing it to practice is an opportunity to get better. It's a loss of privilege. And we kind of agreed to this beforehand. So that's one of the consequences that I think, if we know that, we can deliver that in a very kind but firm and assertive manner. So that would be one other tool I would share with coaches, is to really, figure out what those progressive, small step consequences. So often coaches just go, all right, you're out of practice. You're done for the day. It's like, whoa. Like, where was the other smaller steps before that? Like set them out of a drill, send them out for an, undefined amount of time. Like, hey, when you're ready to come in and start working hard or have a good attitude, you can join us. Right. And you can do that in an assertive way that still is respectful of the person. So that's one element. And I work a lot with that on my coaches, and it's talked about in the book. The other one is just to be creative. And I think we sometimes lack creativity. One thing, is being on time is such a common standard in every program. Well, what do you do when the player that's really important to the team is late for the bus and you got a really important game? Are we is the whole team got to suffer? I mean, technically you could, but you could be a little bit more creative. And one of my coaches just this last year, she got really creative in the fact that the player got on the bus, she communicated to the team, this will be dealt with later, but right now we just need to focus on the game. Well, the next, 2 weeks of practice and games, that player had to be the first person there, and they had to bring donuts to, it was like, a creative way to say, hey, you didn't get off scot-free. Okay. But we're not going to just blow this out of proportion. Everyone makes mistakes, and we don't need to make a point by sitting you out from the game or leaving you behind. And so I think it's about being creative in some of our consequences as well.
That's a good one, JP, which makes me think about, I think Coach K said it, where it's, when you have a bunch of rules, you're basically limiting your leadership. And so why box yourself in with a bunch of rules? I think these are my words, but you're saying the art of coaching and leadership and culture, it's an art. It's not an exact science. There's some science involved, so here's my question for you. How much do you coach coaches on, or you yourself say, we've got to give players more of the why behind it to get more belief and buy-in from the players? Do you think that's something that's missed, and how much do we need to talk about the why behind the what with players?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, because it leads to a great point. Back to your earlier point, though, too, it was John Wooden, I think he said, as he got older, he had a lot less rules and a lot more suggestions for his players, right? But yeah, when it comes to the why, when it comes to the non-negotiables, that's one of the big things that we encourage coaches to communicate is the why. And I remember hearing a pastor talk years and years ago about, why, God had rules, for people in the Bible. And it was three things. It was for the good of the individual. It was for the good of the community. And it was for the good of the relationship between that individual and God. And I was like, oh, that's exactly why I have non-negotiables. It's for the good of the relationship between me and the player. It's for the good of the team. It's for the good of that individual. And I think we can communicate. Being on time is going to help you to have an effective practice. It's not going to be disruptive to the team. And it's really important to me. And we're going to get along a lot better. So that's just one way to communicate your why. But also the way you lay out your standards, is so important. And we talk about kind of standards being laid out with non-negotiables, team standards, and also individual standards. So in the team standards and the individual standards, we ask the team to identify goals or aspirations or visions of theirs, but also an individual player, what we call player improvement plans, where we sit down with them. We say, hey, what are your goals for the season as an individual? What are you hoping to achieve? All right, now what do you need to, where are you currently at in relation to those goals? And what do you need to do to close the gap between where you're at and where you want to be? And so they set standards there on an individual basis. Now, the why is very self-explanatory there. Why is the standard the standard? Because it's what's needed to get me to where I want to go.
JP, what about evidence of excellence? Meaning, when do we know that our culture is really thriving? This is a sign. this happened, and this is an example that our culture is where it needs to be.
I don't know if you're always where exactly you desire to be. You're always searching for more, Sam. But I think one of the first things and one of my first chapters actually in part 4, which is enforced standards. The first chapter is all about celebrating the behaviors and different ways that we can do that within our program in a way that's like authentic and not so much forced, and it's obviously it's little things that you've probably talked a lot of on the podcast before, is catching them doing the good things, not just being there to, hold them accountable to certain things, but it's constantly trying to find ways to celebrate the good things that are happening and also tie that to some of our cultural language. Okay. So the more that we can define the behaviors and have some sticky language around that, the more that I think that will resonate and it will catch on with the player. So, you might have for example, you might have some mantras within your program, like, compete, don't compare. Okay. That's a real, principle of mine. And I have other coaches that share that as well too. So now how do we reinforce that in a positive way there? Well, there's obviously the competitor award at the end of the year and, the typical things, but how are we doing that on a day-to-day basis? How are we honoring the competitor? There's a great story about Anson Dorrance, the UNC women's soccer coach. And oftentimes when in women's soccer and often women's sports, or even just in sports in general, when there's a collision and two players collide and it's an aggressive moment, our tendency is like, oh, is everybody okay? And we run over there and it's like, are we all right here? And we want to come in there and make sure everybody's okay. And oftentimes we maybe discourage the person that made the aggressive play. He'll stop practice and he'll highlight the competitor. He'll say, that's what we need more of. That's what we need more of, right? People that want to go out there and want to throw their body on the line. So it's trying to find ways that you take these principles and they trickle down into the everyday moments within your program. And as you do that, now you start to shine lights on where your culture is going, where you want it to be, Sam. And the more you can do that, the more you're going to get of that.
Oh, sorry, JP. A minute ago, you referenced Wooden, and not the quote exactly, but you were talking about how as he got older, less rules. And I think you've heard Coach K, the one Sam referenced, about less rules and leading, giving yourself more flexibility to do that. Curious is, do you think, and I don't know if you've seen any of this as you've been researching and talking to different coaches, do you think it's more likely that a younger coach would have more rules and as a coach matures and gets a little bit older, they would have less rules because they're more comfortable handling those situations? I often sometimes see, coaches that aren't comfortable handling situations have more rules. Do you think there's any correlation between those two?
I think the challenge that I see is being able to be flexible and adaptable in the moment. And I think that takes with time and experience. And so I can see why a younger coach might feel the desire to have more rules, more clear black and white. But as we know, behavior, and when people have behaviors that are unacceptable, it's not black and white, like being on time is one thing for the, small town coach that there's no traffic in. But I work with coaches that players are commuting over an hour through New Jersey, New York traffic, right? And it's very inconsistent. And so when a player shows up, and they're doing it because they're making a huge sacrifice, their family's making a huge sacrifice so they can be a part of that program. And so it becomes like gray. So it's not always that easy. So I definitely get why younger coaches would want those rules because they want to make it black and white. But this comes back to Sam's point of it. There's an art, there's a skill to being able to step into those moments. And that takes time and that takes experience to do that in a way that's consistent with our values.
Yeah. Curious to also, as you're meeting with different coaches, you're seeing different examples of what's good and what's not. Team building. How does team building relate to a culture? How important is it? Is it just, one of those things that helps just kind of build a relationship? Do you think it's something that should be regularly built in? Because I get this question all the time from coaches, and I like to differentiate between team building, going bowling and eating pizza, from actually building a culture, which is probably a lot more messy, a lot more complex. But how important do you think team building is to actually creating a culture that's significant?
Yeah, I like how you're differentiating it, and it's one thing that I talk about. There's like team culture days, and that's something we talk about widely in our community of coaches that we support, and it's mentioned in the book as well. I shared a story around Sean McDermott at the Bills. And one of the things that he did to build the team culture was actually something really simple early on when he took over there. He just started bringing players in and asking them to talk about one of the most important people in their life that was relevant to getting them to where they are today, right? And they had to get up there and just talk to the whole team and kind of share a bit of their life story. Powerful stuff. At the same time, one of my other stories I share in there is Indiana Wesleyan's basketball coach, Greg Tonigal, and they do service. They go out to Dominican Republic as a team, and they're building bridges, and they're playing games in the summer, like in the Dominican Republic. And then in season, they're, going to prisons and playing games there and ministering. So many different things that we can do that aren't around bowling or paintballing or the traditional ones. I really see team building as getting out there and trying to do a bit of life together and share life together and connect on those type of things. When it comes to the really valuable team building activities that I think really help to reinforce the values that we're working towards. I think those are the best team building activities. When it comes to building team culture, though, so much of that I believe is done in conjunction with those team activities. It's done through the conversations that we create within our team. It's the daily one-on-ones that we're having with players. It's the ways that we are getting them within the practice, before and after practice, to support each other and to hold each other accountable. That's uncomfortable, and that's really, really dirty.
JP, there's been something that's been brought up a couple of times in this conversation, and that's about competition and competing. And I want to dig in on this a little bit and get your thoughts, which is, I think any great program, one of their core values, whether it's stated explicitly or not, is that they compete. They compete in practice. They compete in games. There's a competitive healthiness to that program. How does a coach bring that out in a key word is healthy way?
I like how you point back to the coach first off, because I think so often we want to blame the players today. They're not competitors anymore. They play too many games. They don't want to compete. And I think it first off starts by us reflecting on, do we create a competitive environment that allows our players to compete? And I think that we, obviously when we take potentially like a little bit more of a games-based approach or, different things like creative ways like that, we can create an environment for them to compete in. After that, I think it's really trying to get a clear definition of what competing looks like. And that's challenging, because what competing looks like for us or to this player, to that player, it varies across. It can be very relative about what their best competitive effort looks like. The reality is, though, we really want to hone in on where each individual's at. And so we try to, if you're creating a competitive environment, and, one of the things I'm a big fan of is a competitive culture, where you chart the winners and losers, you create a ranking system, and we got all our coaches that use a spreadsheet, and they put this across the board, winners and losers, we're charting that, we're sharing it with the players. We're sharing it with the parents, at different times. Anson Dorrance at North Carolina has one. Pete Carroll has one at the Seahawks. So it's just, it's a common tool. But say you've got that and a guy still or a girl's still not competing, there can be some other obstacles. And I think it's about trying to go in there and identify those obstacles, but also in those moments of just bringing awareness to their effort and their level. I think so many times players are in the practice and they just lose. They're burnt out. They're tired. They've had loads of games. Or whatever, they've had a long day. If we can just bring awareness to, hey, where's your effort at right now? And to get them to self-reflect and then identify one or two things that they can do to self-correct, they'll often just elevate their effort alone on that. So I think it's a team environment as well as some individual interventions.
Yeah, that's good. And we've done that too. And a lot of that influence came from Anson Dorrance. And I think I've even heard you and Nate maybe talk. Maybe Nate sent me one of y'all's podcasts you did on, because he and I've had so many conversations about it. And Anson Dorrance got that from Dean Smith, to chart everything and to track it and then to share it with players. And it's like, how do you create better leaders? Well, give them opportunities to lead. How do you create better competitors? Give them opportunities to compete. Define it, chart it, track it, right? But, and you alluded to this, I think, earlier. like, how do you define competing? Because if you sit there at the beginning of practice and say, we're going to do a competition day, we're going to compete in everything we do, we're going to have winners and losers, and they're all looking at you and they're like, but you could have 12 players in front of you, JP, and 3 of them have their definition of competing. Those 3 have a different. So, like, how do you define that to your players?
I think, and this comes down to if competing is one of my core values, and I'm saying the standards of my team, first off, I'm going to ask them, what does competing look like and what's competing not look like to them? And we can start to define some clear behaviors around competing. I'll also have potentially my own definition that I would offer them, which would be a core principle or mantra, which is, striving together for excellence. And I might share with them the origins of the word compete. And it's really about coming to give your best. We've implemented the competitive cauldron with some amazing teams. One of them, I remember up in Wisconsin years ago, and their first 5 was phenomenal. They were the best teams in Wisconsin at the time. They had a number 1 player in the country, Patrick Baldwin Jr. And after that, great players, great individuals, but there was a significant drop off in the talent. Well, how do we keep it competitive in that environment? And coaches have to kind of get creative in that those type of situations with the cauldron. But back to your point, come back to identifying the key behaviors, then also create the situations where, you try to, as often as possible, create level playing field where they feel like they can potentially move up that ladder. If you're doing a ranking system on your cauldron, if you're the 12th man on that team, can you get to the 11th spot? There's always at least one area that you can climb on that. So it's kind of a mixed bag there. You want to define the behaviors, but also you're creating that environment.
JP, can you expand a little bit on that and maybe give a little definition to it of aligning behaviors with beliefs? You talked about the behaviors there a second ago, but what does it mean to align your behaviors with your beliefs, and how do you make that happen for a team?
Well, it actually starts with the coach, and I talk about this in the book. We talk about core values, and core values are, I would say, important, but they can become very cliche. And if I look at my own coaching journey, and I share my own story here because I think it's in the book and with other coaches all the time, which is I said I valued certain things like self-control and discipline and accountability, but none of those behaviors were really that evident on a daily basis to my team. I had like a double standard for myself. I was often out of control emotionally. So all the things that I was preaching to my players, like, hey, this is what a leader looks like, it wasn't represented, within my behaviors. Okay. So my beliefs and behaviors didn't match up. And so I think it starts with us as the coach. If we say we value certain things, do our players see evidence in it every day? And when we fail to actually behave in that way, when we make mistakes as a coach, when we lose our temper, when we don't put the effort in that we should, when we're not prepared, do we take responsibility for that? And I think we got to be quick to take responsibility in those areas, and that we actually gain credibility through that experience. So we use our core values as a coach, our core principles. They should influence our behaviors, and we're constantly working to grow as not just a coach, but as a person, right? We often say, if you want to become a better coach, you have to become a better person. The second aspect of that is use those values to, like we just talked with Sam there, is like, okay, competing is a value here. What's it look like? What's it not look like? And getting really, really clear on that in a variety of situations. And one of the tools that we use there is what we call a standard review. We're in the middle of the season. If you really feel like we're not competing, when it comes to the fourth quarter, or you feel like we're not being selfless when it comes to our bench behavior, or we're not being grateful when we go out for team meals, is you take that scenario, you say team meals on the road, gratitude. That's one of our core values. What's it look like? What's it not look like? Just having them define the behaviors in that is off, and just choosing maybe the 3 top behaviors of what gratitude looks like on the road when you're eating out really addresses the standards around there, because just they need clarity in that moment.
Yeah, JP, really appreciate all this knowledge you're sharing with us and with coaches that are listening. And, some takeaways I'm having, I don't know what my question is, but maybe you can just speak off what I'm about to say, is, culture in itself is kind of simple, but it's simple in idea, but it can be complex in execution. You can have a very simple approach to your culture. Simple doesn't mean easy, though. And I would just encourage coaches listening that when you're building a culture, and you said it earlier, it's not like a destination, like it's ongoing. It never stops. It's every day, right? And so when you're building it, coaches and players listening, it's not going to be perfect, and there's going to be bumps in the road, and you got to reset it or have courageous conversations and remind yourself what is our culture, why are we doing it. And so those are some of my takeaways just listening to you talk, JP. So really appreciate that, and I think this is just such an important conversation. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you hit it right on the head. It's a very important point that I should mention real quick. One of the guys that I would say is a huge influence that I've studied over the year, read the book, The Messiah Method. We interviewed him on our podcast, is a guy named David Brandt. Dave Brandt coached at Messiah for about 10 years, early 2000s, won 7 Division III national championships on the men's soccer side. Then he went to coach at Navy, then he was coaching pro, and now he's up at Hope College in Michigan. And Brandt, he, like a lot of other coaches, had a process. He had a 7-step process for building culture. And, I could share all 7 steps, but the important one is step number 7. Step number 7 is repeat steps 1 through 6 10,000 times, right? And so it's about consistency, and I so often as a coach, I think we just kind of come in every year. We're like, we'll try this, we'll try that. Can you do things consistently? And consistently, first off, in establishing the culture, then consistently in supporting and enforcing. You can't do a great job at the beginning of the year, of every year, laying out your standards, but then you don't enforce them, right? So there has to be, that's why those 3 parts of the system, the establish, support, and enforce, are so critical, is that you're tapping into all those elements of it. And at the core of it, what drives that system is you, the leader. And you've got to invest a lot of time on you as a leader, not just you as a coach and you as a person.
JP, before we wrap up here, just got one more question. It's a pain point that I hear from coaches a lot, and we talk about it at our summer sessions with athletes. The whole 10-80-10 theory. 10%. Let's just say there's let's say there's 20 kids in your program, whatever it might be. Top 10% are like 2 people that are just going to stand out, do everything above standard, do it excellent. And then you got 2 at the bottom. They're just going to cause you some problems and some issues. And the other, 16 are kind of in between, and they kind of do what they're supposed to, but you're trying to raise their standard up, make them better, help them to get to that top 10%. But I want to talk about the bottom 10%. There's 1 or 2 athletes that tend to make headaches for coaches, tend to have a lot of problems because of these athletes, and maybe even disrupt the culture a little bit. And, you talk in the book about helping team members to change. How do you actually help them to change their approach to the team, to culture? So let me get your thoughts on that for just a second. Like, how does a coach navigate that when there may be a disruption to the culture, and how do you draw those lines? And I know it's a lot of art more than it is science there, but what are some of your ideas or some ways or thoughts around making sure that there's not a disruptor or 2 in your culture?
Well, I think this is one of the most challenging things, especially when we talk about like transformational leadership or transformational coaches. We're trying to help people make change. We're trying to make an impact. One of the things, though, is that we believe we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to help every individual. At the end of the day, we can only make opportunities available for them to make changes, for them to grow. And so that's our role. And at a certain stage, we have to remove what I would call almost culture killers. And we have a responsibility to do that. Why? Because if that bottom 10%, if there's an individual or 2 in there that are key influencers, they are disrupting us from our mission. Let's just say my mission is to make an impact on the lives of my players. Well, if I have a crappy culture, I'm not going to do a very good job of that. And so they're disrupting me from being able to live out my mission. Now it's about doing things in the right way, where you've given them opportunity, you've invested in them, you've given them chances to make changes, to show that they're willing to grow and change. But if they refuse to make that effort, if they refuse to make those changes, then we have to be selective. And the reality is, if you want to be a special culture, if you want to have a special team, you can't be for everyone. You can't. Now, they can choose to be for you, but you can't just, okay, well, we'll modify for you, right, all the time. You cannot be for everyone. They can choose to be part of your team if they want to meet the standards, and you've given those opportunities. But if you want to be special, you can't be for everyone.
Yeah. Love it. Hey, JP, first of all, just always enjoy conversations with you, and just go way back with the PGC family. And we appreciate all you're doing to just support coaches and to make a difference and make an impact out there. Tell coaches, tell them two things, not just where they can get the book, but why they should get the book.
Well, I think this is a great time of year if you're listening to this in June or July this summer, to get you and your coaching staff fully aligned with a plan, a systematic plan to build your culture this season. Not where you're just throwing stuff at the wall and hoping it sticks. These things that I share in the book, they haven't just been used by some great cultures or leaders that I've read about or interviewed. In the last 5 years, they're battle tested. We've had coaches, the high school, collegiate level, hockey, rugby, basketball, all over the world using these strategies and getting the desired effects they want when it comes to the experience they want for their athletes and the impact that they want to have on them. And at the end of the day, the results they want to have to improve performance. So I would encourage them to check it out for that. You can get it at Amazon, the Culture System, or you can just go over to myculturesystem.com. It's got links for pretty much all over the world on different sites to be able to get that.
That's awesome. And we'll put that in the link when we put it out on social media so coaches can remember where to go get it, but easy just to go get it on Amazon. And we'll put the other links to places you can check it out. Well, JP, we just can't thank you enough for coming and chatting with us today. Really appreciate you being on.
Nah, well, I've been listening for years, and you guys have made a huge impact in my coaching journey, as well as I know a lot of other people. So some of the most genuine, authentic people I know out there, and PGC, gosh, playing as a high school basketball player, the impact it had on me was life-changing. So I owe a lot to you guys as well, too.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. Well, good luck with the book. I know it'll do well. I know that there's a lot of coaches out there that have already had rave reviews about it. And so we're looking forward to what the coaching community thinks of it and how impressed I know they'll already be with it. So thanks for joining the Hardwood Hustle. Hey, he is Sam Allen. I am TJ Rosine, and we look forward to next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Hardwood Hustle, where we believe in the value of a coach. We'd also love for you to join us at one of our fall PGC coaching clinics or Read and React workshops. We have 6 locations to choose from. Go to pgcclinics.com for more information. That's pgcclinics.com. From the Hardwood Hustle team, thanks again. We can't wait to be with you again next week.